Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Monaco post-race reaction. What was your thoughts in this Monaco GP race? Did Charles Leclerc winning his home GP actually make up for all of the hype and the 78 laps of nose to tail running with not a whole lot of action? Did that first lap incidences really give you the excitement that something else was going to be right around the corner that kept you on your edge of your seat? Or was it kind of boring like I thought it was and kind of just run of the mill, even though there was some kind of on track strategies going on because there's actually no action for this because of that incident in the first lap? Everybody was just running on that no stop strategy for the most part. So on the track action, trying to get those gaps or maintain those gaps from the driver's point of view was kind of an interesting idea, but it didn't really play out from what I thought of trying to get that gap so that people could get those pit stops without having to lose positions. It kind of didn't play out as well as I would have liked. So I probably end up thinking this was a fairly boring race, as probably most of you did. So I'll probably give it a 3 out of 10. But what was your thoughts in this race? Did you enjoy it? Did it play out as you expected? Did it keep you engaged, even though you knew it was Monaco and there was not going to be a lot of passing? So that would kind of give you that extra edge to keep involved in it. And Charles Leclerc and the Ferraris winning, where we think this is going to be dominated with a Red Bull season, and it's turning out to be a little bit more engagement in that front running positions than we were expecting. Did that help at all? What was your thoughts? And I'll go from like normal, from the back of the pack to the front of the pack, going through each driver, telling my thoughts on how well they did or didn't do, and kind of if there's anything that happened to them, that I will try to give that information as well. So without further ado, we will start off with Kevin Magnussen and probably basically both Haas's in this point. So we have to start off in qualifying for them, as they had a out of spec rear wing that basically flexed too much during the running of it. And so they ran that in qualifying. And so after qualifying, they were going through their technical regulations checks, and they discovered that wing flexed too much. Haas admitted this as a incident, and it was not intentional. And I think because of that, and it looked like it was an intentional issue, that they were allowed to still participate in the race because of the practice issues, laps that they actually had. But because it was not a in-spec wing, they had to drop out to the back of the pack, even though they actually qualified higher in the order than the 19th and 20th positions. So Kevin Magnussen actually qualified in 15th, and Nico Hülkenberg qualified in 12th. But of course, with that issue, they were dropped to 19th and 20th. Now we get to talk about the on-track action for them. Nico Hülkenberg was doing actually a decent job, I think. He was trying to work his way through, as well as Kevin Magnussen. But Kevin took a little too much risk, I think, in this running. I think it's hard to say if it was totally his fault, and the stewards decided that it was just a racing incident on that first lap. They probably would have taken a different view if it wasn't the first lap. But due to that, they didn't actually penalize him that I saw in this running, but he was getting up alongside. He passed his teammate for the most part, and was getting alongside of Sergio Perez, and just got squeezed out into the wall by Sergio Perez, who I think was trying to get a gap, trying to line up himself up for the next corner, going to the left, watching out for Nico Hülkenberg, and was thinking that Kevin Magnussen would drop out because that tight space that was left, and knowing it was going into a left-hand corner, there wasn't really any point in him coming alongside as much on that run as either. So I think that's what was going through Sergio's head, and just drifted slightly right catching his rear tire with Kevin Magnussen's front tire, which then spun Sergio Perez into the wall and then bounced back out, which caught the Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hulkenberg in that incident, taking out both Haas's and the Red Bull. So in that running, both Haas's were damaged more than they were thinking they were. Because I know Nico Hulkenberg was thinking that his car wasn't quite as damaged as badly, and was hoping that they could get that car fixed in that red flag period, but unfortunately they were not able to do that. So he was out, and Kevin Magnussen had some issues with getting slammed into the wall, and so his car was out pretty obviously. And then if you saw Sergio Perez's car, it was almost demolished in that incident, and so it looked really bad in the middle of that track. So his car was out. Now Sergio actually did end up in 18th position, I believe, initially on qualifying. Yes, in 18th position, but then got bumped up to that 16th position because of Kevin and Nico getting dropped back. But that didn't help him at all, as he was taken out by those two Haas's as well. So he did end up getting that contact and knocked out, and this doesn't really look great on Sergio Perez either, even though I could see it be not his fault in the instance of that. He may have tried to play it a little bit too safe or too much of a thought, so that he could actually try to make it around that and get pushed back into that field where he was actually fighting those Haas's at the back. So that's where it kind of comes into play from my viewpoint on Sergio Perez getting knocked out. So that's the bottom three cars. Now we come to Esteban Ocon, who actually qualified in 11th and was doing a decent job until he decided to dive down in front of his teammate and just kind of went wide because he couldn't make it. He went too far of a dive to really play it out in that first lap, and so he kind of didn't have anywhere to go. He was going so far that he had to go to the edge of the track, which caught his teammate, popping him up because of that front tire and that rear tire interlocking, throwing Ocon up in the air and slamming him back down on the track, doing enough damage on that Alpine to actually where they couldn't fix it during the red flag instance either. So he was out. So that was the bottom four cars on that very first lap that got thrown out, and debris all over the track. So it gave us a nice long delay on that track before we had the restart. Now we come to Guan Yu Zhou, who qualified 16th and ended up in 16th. He actually qualified a little bit farther down in the grid, but kind of got bumped up because of the Haas's. In that instance, he did gain one position on the start of the race, but then just lost it. He originally started on medium, switched to hards on the restart, and then on lap 73, he switched to softs, I think just to try to give it a run to see if he could make it past Logan Sargent, which he was not able to make it. He was following Sargent for a long time with his teammate behind him, and so when they decided to just swap positions between him and Bottas was able to make it around Sargent, it didn't give you that really good look for Guan Yu Zhou. And of course, that was before he pitted, but still, when your teammate can make it past the person in front of you and you can't, even if they have slightly newer tires, it's not the greatest look when you're at the back of the field. So not a great run for Guan Yu Zhou in this running, even though he ended up where he started off the race. So kind of a run for him. I think he was hoping that he could do a little bit better at the end when he got on those softs, which didn't turn out to be the case. Then we come to Logan Sargent, who started off the race in 15th and ended up in 15th. I do actually have him passing Guan Yu Zhou on lap 70 for 15th. Then I think it was a couple laps later when Guan Yu Zhou decided to pit to see if he could come back. Logan Sargent did a run on hards, even though he started off on hards and then stayed on those hards after the restart, that red flag, and went to lap 59 before switching to mediums. He did gain a couple of positions on the start of the race due to all the chaos, but couldn't really make it much from there. So kind of a standard race for Logan in my viewpoint at this point in his career. I think he's not going to make it through, past this season. And I know there's, of course, lots of rumors that he might get replaced in the mid part of this season as well. So hopefully he can, keep it up at least to get the rest of the season out under his belt so that he can get a little bit more, practice, a little more experience involved on these F1s to kind of show that he potentially can, make it in another team and be a good runner for that back of the pack. So hopefully that'll happen for Logan, but I don't really see it coming to play during the season if it stays the way he has been running at the beginning of this season. Lance Stroll qualified in started the race in 13th. He qualified in 14th, but kind of bumped up one position. And then he got thrown back into 14th after some issues. He was kind of going along fairly well in this race. Alonso, his teammate, had the brilliant idea of backing up the field behind him so that Lance Stroll would have enough time to actually make a free pit stop, which he did, and switched over to some hard tires on lap 43, and then promptly ended up hitting the inside wall and getting a puncture, and so he had to restop in lap 50 to get a set of soft tires, which then he kind of came back to the bottom part of the field. So I have him passing Juan Yuzo on lap 57 for 15th and passing Sargent on that same lap for 14th, where he kind of ended up in this running. So I think due to the weird strategy that was involved, I think they had a potential there to put pressure on the people ahead of him, and instead they kind of shot themselves in the foot and not gain any points in this running. So kind of a bad one on Lance, even though I know it's tight barriers and any little mistake can really put that to you, and that's what kind of happened to him in this running. So not quite able to get back into near the points, kind of put him out of contention. So that's kind of what happened to Lance. Valtteri Bottas did all right, I think, even though I thought his strategy was kind of odd that they put him on. He did start the race on 17th position, worked his way up to 13th position. He did start off, originally going to be starting off on hards, but switched to mediums after the red flag on that first lap. And then on lap 16, so not very far into the race, switched back to another set of hards and was able to work his way up to that 13th position. And that basically was on lap 52, basically where he made it back up and they let Juan Yuzo basically trade places with him, and then he was able to put pressure and pass Sargent for that 13th position. So he did gain 3 positions at the very beginning of the race that kind of got thrown out because of the red flag situation. So a decent run for Valtteri, even though they kept him going on that mediums to do actually a pit stop during the race. I guess they were hoping for another red flag or something to that effect that would be able to push him up, or a safety car, I guess, into the running with another free pit stop. But that didn't really play out. So for him to be actually doing a pit stop during the actual race when no one else was doing pit stops, I think that's a fairly good run for him. Showing, and he was actually the first person to actually do a in-race pass at that point, and so that was really kind of neat to see when the announcers, they're like, oh, hey, we actually have a Valtteri pass in the race, so that kind of kicked some of that stuff off for some excitement during this race, for some on-track action that we didn't get to see a lot of. Then we come to Daniel Ricciardo, who I have hardly anything written down for. He qualified in 13th, but started the race in 12th due to the Haas's, and ended up in 12th. He then gained one position on the start of the race, and then kind of got thrown out because of the red flag. He switched to the hard tires after that red flag and basically went the full distance on that hard, kind of right there, behind Fernando. He couldn't really get past Fernando. And this is when Fernando was decided that he wasn't going to get any points earlier on the race. And he thought his teammate was going to be able to get some extra points. So he said, okay, let me back up the field. So he was playing it really safe and backing up the field. And even when he was backing up the field, he was playing it well enough that Daniel could not get past him on track. So in that regard, Daniel was kind of really struggling in that point. So he basically stayed right behind Alonso for all this track and didn't gain or lose any positions in this race. So really frustrating for him in this race, I'm sure, getting stuck behind Alonso where, wily Alonso knows when to push it and when to actually really defend, keeping Daniel behind him in these tight corners. This gives us to Fernando Alonso, who actually, qualified in 16th, but marked his way up to 14th because of the Haas's. So he started the grid in 14th and made it up to 11th overall. And I have him basically really started off in hards, like most of the field, and then because of that red flag, went to a mediums, and he basically stayed on the mediums for the whole stint. So he did a really good job of managing those tires on those medium tires and backing up the field, of course, to try to get his teammate points, was showing that strategy point of view that we know and love from Alonso, even though it didn't really play out at all in this race because of some mistakes of Stroll that occurred. So he just fell just outside of points where he should have pushed it a little harder to see if he could gain that ground in case something else happened to push him into those point range. But that gives me kind of where Alonso was, and that kind of ends the back of the field where we see a little bit of action between where they started the race and where they finished, either good or bad. And we get to the front of the field, which is pretty much where they started the race from. And we have a little bit of things to talk about, but not a whole lot in this running. So we start off with Pierre Gasly, who started off in 10th, ended up in 10th. He basically ran the whole race after the red flag on medium set of tires with some damage. I think they couldn't repair all of that damage in that Alpine, but was enough to let him run in this race. So really good running. I know he's been really frustrated with his teammate on that run. Especially, it sounded like, at least according to him, that there was already some team orders on that regard, and so that didn't play really nicely for him in this incident. So I'm sure there's going to be some lively discussion on Pierre Gasly and the team, and we'll have to see what kind of plays out this week and next with Esteban Ocon, because Ocon, which I probably didn't mention, was noted as the issue of that incident and got a five place grid penalty for Canadian's race. So he will drop 5 places from where he qualifies from. And if that's really what the team orders were and were clear, I'm sure there'll be some lively discussions and potentially other issues that come around for Ocon in this incident. But anyway, Pierre Gasly kind of got stuck in that running. I know he was trying to play it on Alex Albon, but was not quite able to get to that point where he put a lot of pressure on Alex in this running. So he basically started where he ended where he started. So that kind of ends up where Pierre Gasly is. And then we have Alex Albon, which is pretty much the same way. I know he started off on mediums and then switched to hards after the red flag, and then just went on the hard tires for the full rest of the race, and was tried to put a little bit of pressure on Yuki at one point, but was not really able to gain that much ground to get that extra momentum on Yuki during this race, because he had the gaps at certain points, but Yuki still had some pace in that RB, so he really couldn't gain to make a maneuver on Yuki during this run. So he was kind of a boring race, but still got points for Williams, which is always what he was kind of wanting to see anyway. So that's good to know, putting them in that running. Yuki started off in 8th and ended up in 8th. That's actually where he qualified at. It was 8th, which is really good to see. Yuki's doing a really good job in the last few races of coming up there, even though he's not getting really considered for that Red Bull seat. I think he's making a good name for himself, showing what he can do, and hopefully someone else will pick him up from another team, if not be able to stay at that RB team for next season or next couple season in that running. I think Yuki's really kind of matured and was able to really kind of start showing what he can do and what his potential of a race driver is. So in that running, I think he's doing a really good job. He kind of managed his tires, and I know they finally gave him the go-ahead to push, and started to do that, but was not quite able to gain the ground on Lewis that he needed at that point in time on those really old tires. So a good run for Yuki, even though it doesn't look that way on just staying behind Lewis the whole time. I think that's still a good job for qualifying and keeping up in that running between them and keeping up with Lewis for the most part. I know there's a fairly big gap in there, but for RB and kind of putting pressure on Mercedes, that's a completely another thing entirely. So my view is Yuki did a good job in the end. Lewis Hamilton qualified in 7th and ended up in 7th. He was kind of frustrated with the strategy that Mercedes did, because they started off on hards and then the red flag hit, and so they switched to mediums. So he went a whole 52 laps and then switched back to a set of hards, was able to get that gap that he needed to do that without actually losing a whole lot of positions. That did give him the opportunity to get the fastest lap, so that gave him the extra point, but really couldn't put any kind of pressure on Max. And I think there was some miscommunication because on his outlap, because Max pitted as well. And I think if he did a faster outlap, he may have been able to undercut Max in that and gain an extra point or two in that position spot. But due to some issues, I'm not sure if that's communication or some other strategy point of view, the Mercedes kind of let that go. And so he didn't quite gain that extra position, even though he did get the fastest lap in that running between him and Max. So that's a positive, even though I think that team needs to kind of regroup and relook at what their strategy is. Even though they're not quite at the top, but they're still making progress in that running. Then we come kind of the surprise for the weekend, which is Max Verstappen in 6th. He did qualify in 6th. He didn't have a very good qualifying. He couldn't quite get that Red Bull set up to where he wanted it to. So he didn't quite make the front runner like I thought he was going to do. I thought he was going to be like last week, where it's like, oh, yeah, it's not very good, and then come out on qualifying and just put it on pole anyway. That did not happen. He kind of got stuck in the back. And I was kind of surprised with Max as well, being stuck behind George, who was really managing those tires to a significant degree, backing up the field behind those front runners, putting that big gap in there. Max was not able to do anything to get by George Russell. So I don't know if there's anything that was left on the table for Max, or if that setup was just that bad in the sense that he really didn't have anything else to really push that Mercedes in this race because of the way, this track is with the tight grouping around this thing that you really only have a couple places to overtake. So if you didn't have the right setup, you may have been that issue for him. He was able to cut off Lewis after that pit stop. So he did pit on lap 53, switched from mediums to hards, and was able to maintain that and really gain that ground back up. But didn't really put a whole lot of pressure on George, which I was hoping to see. And then we get to George Russell, and I blame all of this strategy on him in this running and the Mercedes, because they basically had him on a set of mediums after that red flag, which then meant he needed to do some serious tire whispering and just management of those tires. So they basically told him, do not keep up with Lando Norris, just manage your tires to a significant degree, to the point where they almost gotten to the point where Lando could do a free pit stop, but managed to get it just below that, so it wasn't quite as easy for Lando to actually do a pit stop if he wanted to. So he was backing up the rest of the field in that running, which then put a lot of pressure on the front runners to run slower, because they didn't want to have the gaps for the other people to do pit stops and then put pressure on them in the front runners, which I think they did the whole chain reaction down the field to run not quite as fast as they wanted, but more like how slowly can we go to actually keep the gaps where we need them without actually causing any issues in front of us or behind us in that running. So I think that was where that all stemmed from, or Mercedes' bad or alternate planning, depending on how you look at it. Really trying to start off on hard tires, and then had the red flag, so they had basically switched to the mediums, which then made it really hard to keep those medium tires for the full stint of the race, the 78 laps. Or in this case, it would be 77 laps on that tire. So really hard to do on those medium tires, but they really didn't want to, had the opportunity to pit because that would push them farther back in the field in this running. So trying to get those gaps correctly to maintain that made it really interesting, slow race instead of what we'd like to see is, pushing those limits. This gets us to Lando Norris, who qualified in fourth and ended up in fourth. He originally started off on mediums and then switched to hards on that red flag and basically stayed there for the rest of the stint. I know at several points he was putting pressure on Carlos Sainz or dropping back, trying to figure out how to get that, but was not quite able to do what he needed to. And I know Sainz was pushing him a little bit farther back once he realized that the gap that Russell was trying to provide might have given Lando Norris a free pit stops that would have been putting on pressure on him and potentially on his teammate in first. So due to that, I think Carlos was trying to slow it down even farther to keep that gap between Lando and George below the free pit stop time limit, but keep him still in line with Piastri so that he could get back to Piastri if needed to do that, and not give Piastri a free pit stop by backing too far up as well. So I kind of put the Ferraris and the McLarens in a kind of a weird mixture here, trying to figure out where they needed to be, what kind of gaps they needed to be with the people in front of them or behind them in this running. So that was kind of talking about like kind of the on-track strategy, kind of interesting, but kind of fairly boring in this sense because it was so slow on this in-track running. So we have a little bit of action and a little bit of grace for Carlos Sainz, who on the very first start did a decent start, got alongside of Oscar Piastri at one point, but his tire caught the flooring of Oscar Piastri and gave, Carlos Sainz a puncture, which then made him run off on turn 4 off into the edge and was able to back it up on his own, which is crucial in this sense to get back to the pits. And luckily for him, there was a red flag and they couldn't determine a true order, or else he would have lost 13 positions. Instead, they put him back into that third position for that red flag restart. So that saved him in this running quite a bit in this stint. I think he should be grateful for the stewards on those rulings, where that instead of being at the back of the pack, having to try to work his way through this non-passing track, that he was able to get back into that third and really help out his teammate in this running and still get on the podium. So that kind of plays out my thoughts on Carlos Sainz. Oscar Piastri, I think, did a fairly good job. He had a pretty good start, but then kind of got stuck because on that second restart, because Charles Leclerc was able to position his car where, Piastri couldn't make it around him in that front without too much danger or risk. So that kind of kept him in that second position, but was able to keep Carlos behind him in that second position as well. So that was basically his race. Then he just sat there and managed tires in this run. So he kind of put pressure here and there. I know it was the very beginning. It was fairly tight, and they would get a little bit bigger. And at the end, I think his tires were kind of worn more so than the Ferraris were, so that kind of put pressure on him. So he still has some learning to do on tire management to do the best, but he did good enough to make it to that second podium position and maintain it, which is always good to see. So this leads us to Charles Leclerc, who qualified in first again, which is really good to see him up in the top running on the Monaco GP, and for the first time was able to pull that out to a win. So really good to see him, get that lifelong dream of getting first in Monaco and to do it in a Ferrari against the season that Red Bull has had in the past few is really nice to see. He had a good start, kind of was able to manage the tires. I know he kind of had a little bit of banter back and forth with his team. Like, really, you want me to drive this slow? And yes, they wanted him to drive slow because of all of the tire management and the other issues that they saw coming up from George Russell, really going even slower in that, building those gaps. So he was trying to keep that gap pushed back enough to not really put any kind of other problems for his teammate or himself because of those gaps behind him. So strategy-wise, it was very well done, even though it was a very boring instance of this race. I did think it was interesting that he was saying that, like, a couple laps down, he was getting so emotional that he had to literally get himself to focus and not to tear up too much in this running to actually cause a mistake that would have been horrible to see in that running. So just to give you an idea, on the 70th GP for Monaco, I see that Charles Leclerc on lap 10 had a 0.79 second lead. On lap 25, he had a 1.42 second lead. And then by lap 50, he was a 1.5. And at the end, he was trying to get that gap to see if he could get the fastest lap, but couldn't quite get close to that. So he ended up backing off, but ended up with a 7.9 second lead over Oscar Piastri at the end. So a fairly good run race. I couldn't really ask for more for Charles Leclerc in this run, even though it was not the exciting race that he wanted or whatever, but he really liked that top position. Finally getting that win in Monaco was really good to see. And of course, he got driver of the day. Not unexpected to have him as his lifelong dream and his home race in that running. So really good to see him in this running. So if you actually made it this far in this boring race and my talk on this boring race, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe if you want to see or hear my thoughts on the Canadian GP in a couple of weeks. I appreciate it, and I'm sure any other YouTuber that you watch would appreciate it as well if you did the same to them. This gets us to the driver standings, and so we can see a little bit of movement in the driver standings because of this. Of course, Max is still in the lead, but we see Pierre Gasly gaining a point, so that pushed him up to 18th position. We see Alex Albon gaining 2 points, dropping him up to 15th position over Ocon and Kevin Magnussen. So those are the two big ones. I should have had red on Esteban Ocon and Kevin Magnussen, and I apologize for that. Then you have the nice order, and of course you still have Oliver Behrman in that running, which is always interesting to see after only one race. Yuki gained some points but stayed in 10th, and then we see basically Sergio Perez dropping back to 5th after his DNF, letting Carlos Sainz and Lando by him. So that puts Lando in 3rd now with 113 points, and Carlos Sainz behind him with 108. And Sergio Perez now at 107, just a point behind Carlos, even though he didn't get to run in this race. That gap has shrunk from 2nd to 1st. So you have Charles Leclerc in with 138 against Max Verstappen's 169. So he still has a good lead, but that still have quite a few races. And so if they start making mistakes, there's still a chance that we would have a different champion for this season. But that is still Red Bulls to lose. What did this do to the constructor standings? So the top runners basically stayed the same. We basically see Williams jumping up to 8th with 2 points. Jumping over Alpine, even though they got a point, they still dropped down to 9th. We still have Red Bull with now 276 points over Ferrari's 252 points. So there's still a good race there to be had, even though Red Bull has the lead with a decent amount. Then we have a bigger gap between Ferrari and McLaren, but McLaren seem to be coming back fairly strongly in the last few races, so we'll have to watch that gap between the 184 and the 252. Then, of course, Mercedes with a 96 with a decent lead over Aston Martin. And, of course, we have RB still making progress, gaining 24 points. So they may be actually making a run on Aston Martin. We'll have to watch out for that. Haas losing in this instance because they had potential to make points in this race and ended up making 0 points. So they stay in 7th. And then we talked about Williams and Alpine. And Stake is yet to score, so they're in 10th position. So, what is coming up next? It is, of course, the Canadian or Gilles-Villeneuve GP race, and that's a couple of weeks' time. It has a length of 2.710 miles, so it'll have 70 laps run on this circuit for a total race distance of 189.686 miles. And the lap record holder is Valtteri Bottas in 2019 with 1 minute 13.078 seconds. And this GP race was first introduced in Formula One in 1978. And again, that is going to be the main regular race. There's no sprint race for this one. So the good old normal race venue again, going to be on Sunday, June 9th. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.